The early to mid-1900s marked the growth of a brand new genre of music that would change the industry forever: jazz. Jazz music brought out some of the most talented and influential American musicians ever known, including Kid Ory. Edward Kid Ory was an architect of classic jazz music. Throughout his career, Kid Ory highlighted the talented side of African Americans and served as a role model to them. Blacks and whites were united by jazz as its popularity gained the attention of fans of all races. By allowing others to share his passion for a genre of music associated with black culture, Ory ensured that white Americans couldn't deny their tolerance and even respect for African Americans. Of course, segregation was prominent in America throughout Ory's career, even in the jazz industry. However, Ory's work and jazz in general showed that African Americans were just as capable as whites, and in some aspects had skills that even Caucasians lacked.
Edward Ory was born on December 25, 1886, in LaPlace, Louisiana. Ory's hometown was right outside the city, credited as the birthplace of jazz, New Orleans, and the boy who would become a prominent jazz icon was always interested in music. At age 14, Ory had already organized multiple bands and had just obtained his first instrument, a banjo, bequeathed to him following the death of one of his relatives. Though the banjo was Ory's first instrument, he would go on to learn a number of instruments, including the saxophone, clarinet, and the instrument he was most well known for, the trombone.
In 1912, Kid Ory's pursuit of a music career guided him to New Orleans. A jazz mecca, New Orleans was, as of 1910, the largest city in the South, and when Ory arrived, his band immediately gained recognition, as jazz artist Wilman Broad stated.
The Olympia was best band at the time until Kid Ory and his band from LaPlace came to town. The Ory band was smoother and more polished than the New Orleans bands.
New Orleans swarmed with up-and-coming jazz musicians, many of whom gained popularity thanks to Ory. Not long after he had arrived in New Orleans, Ory needed a replacement clarinetist, and came across a local named Johnny Dodds. Ory explained,
"One day I needed a clarinet player, and I heard about a guy who was working on the street around the corner that had a clarinet and was playing in his lunchtime. His name was Johnny Dodds. I went to see him. He just bought his clarinet, just playing the scale. I said, 'Come to rehearsal on Tuesday.' We played at Come Clean Hall at Gretna. I paid him $2.50, top salary in those days. He didn't want to take it until he played better. I said, 'Take it, you did all right.'"
Johnny Dodds continued to prosper in the music business, and would work again with Kid Ory in Chicago. His fame and talent allowed him to become a respected and famed black musician in a still racist America. In helping Dodds become famous, Ory highlighted the potential of black Americans as relevant contributors to society. While Ory impacted society's racial tolerance with the tutelage of musicians such as Johnny Dodds, a new member of Ory's band in 1913 forever changed African American history and would become the face most associated with jazz, Louis Armstrong.
Benny, the drummer of my brass band, had taken Louis under his wing. I liked Louis's playing so much that I asked him to come and sit in with my band any time he could. Louis came several times to different places where I worked, and we really got to know each other.
Louis Armstrong continued to work with Ory and soon became the most famous jazz artist of all time. Armstrong continued as an icon of African American culture even after his death in 1971. By helping Armstrong gain traction as an artist, Ory improved the perceived role of blacks in American culture. Many of Ory's clients in New Orleans were white as well, indicating a sense of tolerance of black musical artists among the Caucasian community. Ory had made a statement in New Orleans, but after a business deal with sponsor Pete Lala had gone wrong, he found himself at odds with his longtime benefactor and could no longer work in New Orleans.
I knew I'd never make it and decided not to operate anymore, and it wasn't long after that I made up my mind to leave New Orleans for the West Coast.
With his band promising to follow soon, Ory and his wife moved to Los Angeles in August 1919.
Once Ory had arrived in Los Angeles, his work immediately began to pick up. As multiple members of his band eventually traveled to California, Ory's popularity was once again cemented and by a diverse crowd. During his time in Los Angeles, Kid Ory played a number of black and tan clubs, which were clubs that catered to both black and white patronage. Ory's music helped unify these races by giving them something to enjoy and experience together.
Professor Bruce Mitchell wrote to encourage the teaching of jazz music for its contributions to breaking racial barriers in Jazz, a Multicultural Phenomenon. Mitchell found jazz to be a flexible and universal music genre and felt that this quality was the epitome of racial variation and acceptance.
Kid Ory had done well for himself in the 6 years he had stayed in Los Angeles. However, it became apparent to Ory that Los Angeles was no longer the right place to make jazz music, and would soon get the chance to work in the new jazz hotspot, Chicago.
Kid Ory was a New Orleans musician. He relocated in Chicago. He was one of those traditional New Orleans jazz musicians that came up to Chicago.
In 1925, Ory received 2 invitations to travel to Chicago. The first was from King Oliver, who wanted Ory to be part of a newly forming band, the Dixie Syncopators. But this offer wouldn't have convinced Ory to relocate if not coupled with Louis Armstrong's invitation to be part of Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. Armstrong's bandmates were no strangers to Ory. 3 of the other 4 members, Johnny Dodds, Johnny St. Cyr, and Armstrong himself, were all members of Kid Ory's band in New Orleans. Lil Hardin, the 5th member, had no experience with him, though this caused no problems with Ory.
The only one of the Hot Five I hadn't played with was Lil, but that made no difference. She was a fine piano player, and from the first we all worked together very easily.
Ory's work in Chicago produced some of his most famous pieces. In 1926, the Hot Five produced Muskrat Ramble, Ory's most well-known song. Later, in 1927, a recording of Ory's Creole trombone was produced by the Hot Five, another signature piece by Ory. These pieces helped to contribute to the seemingly never-ending popularity of jazz music in Chicago. It wasn't only African Americans who grew attached to jazz culture. White Chicagoans found jazz music just as appealing as black Chicagoans, as dance halls throughout the city commonly played jazz music for their Caucasian patronage. White musicians also jumped on the jazz bandwagon, as Ory's contributions in the late 20s and early 30s would help inspire many white jazz musicians, including Wild Bill Davison, Mez Mesro, and Benny Goodman.
Some of the white musicians listened to the black musicians and were influenced by them.
It seemed no matter what race a musician was, jazz was a platform that Chicagoans would show respect for. Even black musicians would be admired by white fans, giving African Americans an opportunity to be treated equally and held to the same standards as white artists.
The music itself is the common ground, and whoever is playing that music, you'll probably get a correlating feeling of appreciation across the board from anyone who's listening to it, especially if it's just well-played music, and those guys know how to do it right.
Ory had created multiple hits during his years in Chicago, and helped create rise to new jazz artists, both black and white. However, as time progressed, jazz music began to decrease in popularity. Kid Ory's work began to slow, and he returned to Los Angeles in 1930. By 1933, under the pressure of the Great Depression, Ory had retired from jazz and became a janitor.
Ory returned to record and perform in 1944 and continued to show the capabilities of African Americans, as Will Davidson, journalist for the Chicago Tribune, wrote in 1946.
Listen to Ory, and you will hear a superb demonstration of what a group of good Negro jazzmen can do.
Ory's work began its final descent despite tours in Europe in 1956 and 1959. Ory then retired in Honolulu, where he celebrated his final birthday. Ory was 87 years old when he died. Ory's legacy, however, continues to live on. The unification that his music brought to a racially segregated nation is apparent in all parts of society today. While Ory may have never spoken out against racism, he instead fought it by bringing together seemingly opposite worlds. Kid Ory's contributions to jazz went beyond pop culture to push racial equality forward, which shows the great potential of what good music can do.
Tonight we are to hear the deathless Muskrat Ramble. Kid Ory, who wrote the tune, will play his trombone. The clarinet is Jimmy Noon.